let's get into the big topic of open source, something that we actually say at Red Hat.
We haven't
This is so
we
awesome.
are an open culture that believes
actually
in
a big
importance of
piece
What is that process that a developer, or let's say
as the Kubernetes ecosystem really boomed.
Hello and welcome to Ask OpenShift Admin Office Hours live stream. I am host Andrew Sullivan, and I am joined by my co-host, Mr. Jonny Rickard. How are you, sir? Y'all are giving me weird
good,
looks.
man.
Like, did something happen with the audio here?
Yeah, it happened again.
Yeah. Oh, well, I got nothing. Well, we'll plow on. We will move forwards, and you know what? I swear it's these things. Like anytime this thing happens. Yeah, or let me rephrase that. Ever since I updated, that's when it started happening. I was like this.
You're just showing off now.
You know, it's Mac OS. It's Sonoma. Anyways, I'm distracted. Hello, everyone. So I am Andrew Sullivan, co-host here on the Ask an OpenShift Admin live stream, joined as always by my other co-host, Mr. Jonny Rickard. How are you, sir?
I'm hanging in there, man. I feel much better from last week. Got my energy back, so
I know
glad.
I'm
happy.
You had about a malaria or typhoid or I don't know something last week, didn't you?
Yeah, I had like the most serious case of man flu possible. You know, like I probably had like in most traditional cases, it's probably like a common cold. But you know, because it's me and I'm a wimp when I get sick. Man flu level 8. You know, so
at least you own up to it. That's all I got. At least you own up to it.
That's right. Yeah.
So this week we are joined by also one of the live stream hosts, Michael Foster. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's been a minute since you were on this live stream. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, maybe do a plug for the security stream as well.
Sure. Yeah, it's Mike Foster. I'm a StackRox co-community lead, so the open source StackRox project, which is upstream of Red Hat Advanced Cluster Security. And here at Red Hat, we like doing everything free and open source. So again, you can try out StackRox. I'll put some links in the chat. We also have a free trial. So if you want to just go in instead of having to set up a cluster and do all that stuff, you can get right into the console. Also, Slack channel that you can ping our engineers directly. I have a whole list. So when you guys give me a chance to catch my breath, I'll put everything in the chat for people and need some feedback. So let us know what you think.
And that's risky, exposing engineers to the outside world.
Yeah, that's so funny too, because we set up the Slack channel for the open source community, and they're like, "Well, can we have it in our own Slack channel?" And I'm like, "Do you want that, or do you want it in the CNCF Slack channel?" They're like, "Oh yeah, good point." So,
solid point.
Yeah, it's a good notification separator, and we do community meetings every month to address any issues that pop up. Of course, StackRox can be used on any XKS system, but there's a certain amount of support, obviously, that comes with open source. So use at your own peril.
Yeah. StackRox, the name from the former company that was acquired by Red Hat, which I'm super happy to see that we kept that in the upstream project once it was open sourced. It's been about a year since it was fully open sourced, I think.
We had our 19th community meeting, so a year and 7 months now.
Oh, wow. It's been that long?
Yeah.
Man, pandemic and shutdown and all that just compressed those 3 years into like just oblivion in my head. I don't know what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been great feedback. And I think we got to 1,000 stars for the first time. It's an interesting project because it is pretty complex. So if you're ever looking to get into it, something like, upstream Claire, the Claire scanner is a somewhat smaller, more scoped project. So I do find that that's a big hurdle, but yeah, it's been a fun ride.
Yeah. Well, we're happy you're here and happy to have you joining us today to talk about runtime security. And we will get much more into that here in a few minutes. So this week is week 3 of 4 in our DevSecOps lead up into KubeCon. So we, as is tradition, will not be streaming during the week of KubeCon. However, this month has sort of been just focused entirely on those topics, right? Building up into the things that we'll be talking about, showcasing lots of announcements and other things that are going to be, I won't say co-located, but happening concurrently with KubeCon. So keep an eye on, the Red Hat official channels, redhat.com, the is it press/press, I think is the press room or something like that. There's always a ton of stuff going out. You'll see it if you are in any way, shape, or form paying attention to what's happening at KubeCon, I'm sure. So with that, so this is the Ask an OpenShift Admin office hours, which is a live stream here on Red Hat Live Streaming, where we spend our time talking about whatever the topic of the day is, but also focused on answering questions from you all or from our audience. So anything that comes to mind regarding OpenShift, please don't hesitate to reach out to ask those questions in whatever platform you're watching us on YouTube or Twitch, wherever it happens to be. It'll get broadcast into the chat, and the three of us will do our best to answer those questions. We are, between the three of us, we know a fair amount about OpenShift in various aspects, but we don't know everything, and that's okay. We do have, and we were just chatting about this before we started today. We do have the ability to reach into the engineering teams, to reach into the other product teams, all that other stuff, so that we can hopefully get answers while we're here on the stream. Which is also a lot of fun when we do other streams like the What's New last week. Mike, you saw me in the various chats, and I was, asking on Blue Jeans as we're going through, like, hey, somebody on the live stream asked this, and getting responses from the PMs or in Slack or anything like that. So don't hesitate to reach out, folks.
Yeah, worth calling out too. We have the What's Next coming up next week on Thursday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern. So that's the OpenShift roadmap over the next year. Obviously no guarantees, but it's pretty cool to see where the product's going. A lot of it from open source feedback and customer feedback. So join. You can ping a bunch of questions at Sully and I. I think we might have to rope Jonny in to answer questions too eventually.
Yeah, and I think what a lot of people don't realize, Mike, is you're the wizard behind the curtain when it comes to the What's New and What's Next stuff. It's actually you who's driving those. Yeah,
just hit play and don't touch the screen for a while.
Yeah, I'm just the guy who's answering questions in chat and trying to keep up with everybody. But you're the one who's the master of ceremonies, if you will.
I'm the man behind the man. I sit behind Andrew, and I'm like, yeah, he's got this.
Yeah, I think
hold him up.
It's a really cool thing that Red Hat does internally and externally. So it's an internal presentation for everybody at the company, and it gets broadcasted, and then we take it, clip it, and send it out to make it public for our partners, users, open source communities, etc. I don't think there's any other organization that does that publicly.
No.
So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it's pretty awesome. And, we've been doing it for a couple of years now. Of every one of those What's New and What's Next presentations, it's not done separately. Like, we don't have an internal one and one for partners and one that we do publicly. They're all done simultaneously. It is that live stream. We just, the internal Q&A and the internal chat, we just don't live stream out because there's lots of other, questions that folks ask, businessy related things and all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, bickering over who sounds bad and all that stuff. So
yeah.
I did get a kick out of the chat last week around the timing. That was pretty funny. Mm-hmm. We have 100 and something slides and we're 20 minutes behind. Like, we need to go faster. Like,
yeah. Anyways, but so the What's Next is on Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern. Again, come with some questions. Check out the roadmap. Runtime security. I wanted to kick this off as we get into it by just opening the floor to anybody in the chat who's worked at a company, who's come up with, who's run into a security event. This could be CI/CD. Obviously, the topic's runtime, so malware scanning, credential pulling, any insider threat, system behavior, scenarios where a developer had access to prod and everybody shut everything down because they're like, oh, like somebody has access and they realize it's their own internal teams. Give us your funky use cases, funky scenarios. Otherwise, I'm going to pull from Jonny and Sully to kick it off. But yeah, so throw it in the chat. I do just kind of want to preface the field and just bring it up, like what runtime security really refers to. So that's just basically the execution of systems at runtime. That could be infrastructure applications. So that's something like Ansible. It could be the OpenShift components. It could be just your application running your container in a Docker instance on your local computer, right? If something is exposed to the internet and it gets hacked, that would be considered a runtime incident. So there's a huge list of what is considered runtime. I think I technically, in my brain, I kind of break it up into two different spots. There's prevention measures, and then there's monitoring the actual detection itself, right? So something like a developer having access to the memory and CPU statistics of their application is a pretty simple prevention measure, because if memory or CPU goes up, maybe you're like, oh, I'm getting crypto mined or something like that is happening. It's not the typical behavior. But then there's also things that security teams care about, which is, malware, network detection, credential pulling, things of that sort. So it is sort of an all-encompassing, let's say, task for teams. So I'm curious to hear the chat's thought about runtime, any things that they've run into. Other than that, I'm going to ping Jonny to see if he has any interesting use cases that we can chat about.
We want to start this off? Do we want to, well, I was going to ask, Andrew, do you want to do the rest of the top of mind, or do we want to do
Jonny, it worries me that you're surprised at this point. I don't.
I'm not really surprised. I'm just okay, I'm kind of surprised.
Yeah, we can. It might hit the big one that I wanted to hit on, which was next week, the what's next happening. Someday I will get those two things straight. So maybe while folks are thinking about any runtime security, real world examples that you've encountered that we can maybe chat through. Jonny, if you want to go through the other, 2 or 3 top of mind things.
Yeah. So the call for proposals for Summit is going on right now. So if you have something that you want to present, Andrew makes a good point about this every week, right? It's if there's something that you are interested in or that you've got some passion about, but you don't necessarily want to speak, go ahead and submit it, and just get it out there so people know about it. And then the other one, and here's the link, by the way. And the other 2 were yours. There's the network observability operator 1.4 has been released. We got to dig into that a little bit more before we before I try and come up here and act like I know what I'm talking about. I just need to dig in on it and get some good talking points on it. But I think it's something that we should probably demo in another stream when we have one of our mixture streams kind of go on. And then the other one is next week is the last episode of our security series for October, and that's going to be with Jafar, and he's going to talk about CI/CD pipeline security. So we're going to talk about supply chain, DevSecOps, right, all those fundamental pieces, and then the OpenShift layered products and stuff like that we use together to bring that story along and show off our DevSecOps pipeline. Yeah, I think that's it. So.
Yeah, so the network observability stuff, I put a link to the blog post around that. So as we were going through and talking about network observability, as they were going through the what's new last week and all that other stuff, something occurred to me, and I sent you a message on this, Jonny. We really need to have a topic about eBPF here on the stream.
Yeah, totally.
Because it's one of those things, I have a very basic understanding of what it is, but definitely something that I wanted to learn more about, and importantly, where we're incorporating it into OpenShift. I know we've had Mark Curry here on the stream before. I know he's very knowledgeable in that area. I actually ran into him in the tower last week when I was in. I actually went into the office twice last week. Even that's the most I've been into the office in 4 years. I know. So, all right.
Just to jump in, there's a bunch of ACS engineers that work with eBPF daily because StackRox and ACS has an eBPF module, and in fact, we just switched to a new one. So eBPF has evolved, and now there's core BPF, compile once, run everywhere, BPF, which is really useful for different Linux systems. Because if you had Amazon Linux or you had RHEL or something like that, they'd have different eBPF modules that had to be managed. So the engineers are extremely happy that it's going to consolidate across the different Linux systems, and it's just one BBPF module that needs to be managed moving forward. So I think it's going to be good for just general runtime security and incident response. It allows you to focus on the features in the product and not just managing all those different kernel modules and stuff like that. So,
and if I'm not mistaken, ACS just switched to something in 4.1 or 4.0, right, where they went from a standard Linux module. I can't remember what it was, but they went to eBPF. Base. I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, we had kernel modules and we had eBPF modules, and we allowed the user to pick and choose which they want. We defaulted now to eBPF as a standard collection method, and then now it's moving even further to core BPF as the default, probably in the next release. Just because once we get to that, it's hey, that's the module. It works on every Linux system. Just use that. Go right.
Nice.
So it's gonna be great for the product.
Yeah,
And
that's
honestly, for
awesome.
everything else that's downstream, there's a lot of work being done. So
Yeah. Well, I understood about 50% of that.
I just ran into it because I had the old standard collection or
Mhm.
I can't remember what you call it now, but like we had the default before the eBPF one, and like when I guess we went to 4.1 or 4.2, it had changed completely, and it's like, hey, it's not even, it broke.
Yeah, you
Don't do
missed
it.
all my messages about the deprecation. Hey, it's going away. Move to VPF. You missed all those, and then all of a sudden 4.1 snuck up on you. It's okay.
Yeah, that's
It happens.
it's a curse, man. Like it's. I wish I was. I try and stay up to date on everything. There's just too much. So.
Yeah, yeah, no worries. Yeah, and 4.0 was a big shift for us, right? As a database migration with a bunch of changing things. So it is really cool. 4.0 is one, the migration went pretty seamlessly. At least I didn't receive any complaints for the database migration, and then it just allows us to scale. You can bring your own Postgres database now. It allows for greater performance, high availability, things like that. So along with the ACS cloud service, it's really good for the product. I know people always get scared whenever you see, it was a 3.7.4 and then it goes to 4.0. And so we went, 74 releases without updating the major release. It's like, oh my God, there's a huge breaking change. It's like, yeah, it's a small database change that's pretty manageable. So again, if you're trying ACS for the first time, you don't have to worry about that. Do the cloud service free trial and everything is extremely smooth.
Yeah, I'm happy to see that, by the way. Happy to see because it's always a bit of a hassle to size, right? Like step one is always, well, how much resources am I going to need? And you have to go in and dig in and figure out all of these things in order to just size the deployment, to be able to stand it up, to be able to even begin to test it. So I love seeing the software as a service, the cloud service aspect. Anyways.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things with Central is you install it and then you have, a 10,000 node cluster. Okay. What type of memory are you going to need for that? Right. So that's always a challenge. And some of it's learned. We have a lot of great partners. One of the biggest clusters is IBM, for example. Right. So like you get to use and scale with something like that, and a lot of good feedback.
Nice.
So jumping back to runtime security. So I'll say terse summary of runtime security is it's basically anything that is, any security measures, anything that's happening as your applications are running. And that could be as they're being instantiated. We've talked before about how ACS will monitor, it basically has hooks inside of Kubernetes, inside of OpenShift, so that when it sees a process spin up, hey, you're not allowed to run bash, and it'll interrupt that. It'll prevent that from running. But it can also be a number of tools that are there in order to find, detect, and I don't know if you would include isolate, but certainly detect and identify when something unusual is happening. So, funny story, kind of anecdotal or experience for me is it's actually how I became a storage admin. We had a developer who they created a Perl script, because I like to use all of the keys on my keyboard. So Perl is the language of choice. And it threw an error and it went into a loop that was just constantly logging out messages. And it consumed all of the resources of one of our rather large Spark servers as it was just in this run condition, as well as was consuming terabytes of storage. Now, mind you, this was in the mid 2000s as it was going through. And, I became an accidental storage admin because we had to do something to prevent it from filling up the entire storage appliance and taking the entire site offline, for as long as it would take to clean that up. So having something, an actual runtime security tool, something that could find and quickly identify that type of scenario, even though that one was completely innocent, it actually did cause, have large ripples, inside of the organization. Tools like that, super important. And, I think most of us that have been doing this for a while, or probably not even a while anymore, as frequently as it seems like these things happen, we've encountered some sort of scenario, some sort of incident, some time where, oh no, something's wrong. Something has gone badly. What do I do? What are the tools at my disposal?
Yeah, and that's sort of the first part of that runtime security conversation, which is, protection measures around metrics, especially internal, right? Developers have tools. Sometimes there's memory issues, things bloat. And so there are protections in Kubernetes and OpenShift, for example, around resource requests. And I remember 6 years ago when the security conversation in Kubernetes was really kicking off, it was, why is resource requests a mandatory policy in security tools like ACS and things like that? It's like, yeah, because if you set memory limits, then you don't run into that issue because your application starts scaling, and maybe there is your example. Well, it's just going to get killed, and then it's going to start scaling again, then it's going to get killed. And so that is somewhat annoying, especially if you don't size your applications correct, but that is the protection for it, right? So that I would say falls a little bit more on the developer / security to make sure that's there by implementing a policy saying, hey, this doesn't get to production unless you have these controls. But then also on the developers for knowing their applications. Although you could talk about roles and responsibilities and we could bicker about that all day, but that's one part of the equation.
There's also, I sympathize and I understand when it's difficult to know what those resource requirements are. And, this is where, as administrators, it's one of those things where we're always going to have a job doing those types of things, of utilizing the tools to go through and over time do trend analysis, work with those developers, work with those teams in order to figure out what that looks like and incorporate that into our, capacity planning conversations and all that. There's also a whole bunch of tools, right? I think many of the monitoring tools these days do anomaly detection as well. So you can, even if you don't have a limit set, you can still find those things hopefully relatively quickly and be able to take action. It's funny. I was chatting with someone from one of the services that we run. I want to say it was Sandbox, or maybe no, it was when we used to use Katacoda for all of the learning environments on learn.openshift.com. And apparently one of the, there was a significant amount of resources that went to just squashing all of the bots that would come in and use it for crypto mining. Because they would just come in, there's no authentication, there's no barrier to going in and pulling those learning environments, and they're all running in AWS instances. So people would come in and or bots would come in and pull a bunch of them and crypto mine for as long as it could before it got squished.
Interesting. And so the eviction process was based around CPU, I'm assuming, and not a simple download. Right? So it really just depends on how the barrier would be set up there.
Yeah, I don't know the details other than there was a fair amount of time, multiple people over the entire span to keep an eye on it. And, it's a constant battle, right? Every time you develop a new method of, hopefully keeping that out or squashing it before it becomes a problem, there's a new way that it can be exploited.
There's an interesting question in the chat. Is there an ACS checklist for Zero Trust, I'm assuming, or is runtime a very small consideration? If you want to talk about supply chains, come next week for Jafar. But yeah, I'd say from Zero Trust standpoint, if you look at the SALSA framework, runtime is a very small section. Zero Trust also means the application, all the code that you're downloading, the pipeline needs to make sure that there's a principle of least access. In general, ACS has a ton of policies to help you set up Zero Trust, but that's on the security and operations team to implement them, right? If I use the example of Kubernetes network openness as to sort of the general view, is the Kubernetes network is open. You come in, you implement policies that limit applications to only the scope that they're needed. And that's sort of your Zero Trust baseline. But if we created Kubernetes and we implemented deny all at the beginning, nobody would know how to start or run their apps because you don't get a feeling for the network connectivity that you need to set a baseline. So ACS in general comes in, gives you that baseline network detection, shows you those runtime incidents to say, hey, you have bash scripts that are getting run in these containers. Is this what you want? Yes or no? And then based off of how you're viewing your application and running, then you can set up those enforcement policies to make sure that you have a principle of Zero Trust. But again, Zero Trust is just a terrible marketing term.
Oh man,
and is very hard in real life. Just the general thought of limit access to everything unless it's necessary, that's not as great as just saying zero trust. But as a general principle, yes, that's what you're trying to achieve.
Well, it's reminiscent of SE Linux policies, right? Where, for a long time it was run, I have a new application, I'm deploying it to my server, run in permissive mode, collect all the information that you needed, and then I think it was not until like RHEL 4 or RHEL 5 that we finally released the tool that would go in and analyze all of those messages and spit out the policies that you needed instead of having to do it by hand. Man, I hated doing that.
Yeah.
But yeah, similar in concept, it very much reminds me of that, what you were talking about there, Mike, of like if you just turn everything off from the get-go, it's much more difficult, much more frustrating, and then you end up in that, like we still joke about, a lot of people go in and the first thing they do is set SE Linux to permissive or disable it entirely.
Yeah, and you think about if there's the individual conversation, but really organizations are broken up into teams, and so how do you implement a new platform when everything's extremely restrictive? That's why we have testing, staging, production, right? Testing might be pretty open, network segmented towards the individual group, but open internally. And then you go through the process of promoting. And it's those gates that's where security steps in and starts enforcing more and more strict rules as to what can or can't happen. And then the industry will also dictate certain things, right? If you're implementing a bank, security is going to come and say, these are the things that we're not caving on at all for compliance reasons. Then those are just going to be hard coded in your pipeline, and they're not really going to change. So it's up to the developer to make the adjustment, or again, just sort of an organizational challenge, I think. And that's why I tend to break it up in my head in two different ways, which is the developer, preventative measures, memory, CPU, file system access, and things like that they can see, that they've been given access to see in their testing and staging environments. And then security typically is the one that's looking at production environments and saying, hey, this is bad behavior, right? I know that there are organizations where developers touch production and have access, but I mean, that's not best practice, obviously.
Yeah.
Wait, isn't that called DevOps?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a ton of organizations that have done it, but
yeah, and the whole idea, right? It's not to slow developers down, right? We're trying to keep things going and moving like at a reasonable pace for our developers, right? Like we want them to be able to build their things and get their stuff out quicker, but we also need to protect everything at the same time. And if we go back to like Chris last week, right? This aligns perfectly with what Chris was talking about with the configuration management, especially about like, having bash scripts running in your container images, or you have like package managers and stuff like that in your images. Those are like the little basic things that you can take out when you start promoting into like that next stage, like staging, QE. Like the closer you get to production, like the more awesome stuff that's in those images starts to get pulled out, right? And it's very scoped.
Yeah, and security teams want visibility into that, right? You have probably one security team, 10, 12, 14 development teams, let's say, at an organization, security teams in charge of managing it all. They always want visibility into the different stages to say, okay, I see this application, I see its performance, I see its network, what it's doing. Why is this bash there? Why doesn't it have an SEC profile attached to it? Why does it use the default service account in OpenShift or Kubernetes? Those are all bad practices. Let me circle them, send it to them and say, hey, for the next sprint, can we prioritize adding these, right? Yeah. So it also, they want a tool that has the working relationship. For some organizations, some are heavy-handed again, but that tool that gives that observability is going to be extremely useful. And I mean, we see it with some of the big time cloud players, right? Organization or like tools like Wiz, for example, don't necessarily have the runtime security and enforcement layer aspect to it, but they're very big on cloud observability, everything through API. And you can just get a grasp of what everybody's doing so that we can make small changes and nibble at the edges so that we can lower our, let's say, risk profile to be controversial. That seems to be a lot of what security teams have been asking for lately. It's that observability aspect.
I want to go back a moment, and thank you, Mike. I want to go back a moment because I called out DevOps, and we all kind of giggled. And I want to point out that I don't think any of us think that DevOps in and of itself is a bad idea or insecure in any way. I don't know if you can see the books well enough in behind me, but the Phoenix Project is one of them. It's one of the yellow ones. I don't remember which one. but I think rather it's the DevSecOps, right? Incorporating security into that. And it's okay if developers have access to production, right? It's okay if developers are doing those things, so long as they're security conscious and security aware. You don't want, Jimmy Random, coming onto the software team, the developer team, and having access to those things. And in the middle of, a crisis, an outage or something like that, you're going in and you're doing unsafe, unsecure things with the application. You still want to have that mindset. So it's okay. We just, again, incorporating those practices, incorporating the security team, even if you do have to do something, quick react in order to get, the application back up and making money or doing whatever it does, the security team follows and, hopefully quick follows and ensures that those practices have been adhered to.
Yeah, and I think touching on the zero trust conversation that popped up, there is a difference between developer having access with one credential and developers having access with specific credentials, right? Like if a developer has, one SSH certificate into every single node, well, then that's a high impact issue if they ever get hacked, versus if security teams have like structured access tokens for a development team, if something pops up that gets sent to them to say, hey, I'm going to give you access to production to just your environment so you can make this one change, that is access that is more structured. It's a little bit slower, but it would be, you're limiting that impact of a potential cert hack or something like that. So there's different ways to do it. Different organizations have different processes, but again, you can have access. As a security team, I would try to limit that access to being very scoped to your use case. And you're not going to know that until you observe the day-to-day behavior of the applications and the teams.
Yeah, before I came to Red Hat, and I guess even after I went to Red Hat, one of my customers had this, you had to go get a token for anything that you wanted to do with elevated privileges, right? So if you wanted to use your admin account at all, you had to go out and get a token, and it had to be approved by, a manager or somebody in the chain of command somewhere. And you were limited to like a certain amount of time. Like you could either do it for 8 hours, or like an hour or 8 hours. I can't remember. But that was it. Like you couldn't get like a 3-day pass or whatever and have full admin credentials. It was literally like you had to justify why you needed it for the length that you needed, and then they would approve it, and then you'd get your token, and then you could reuse that. And initially when it first happened, I was like, this is dumb. It's so exciting. I hate doing it, but it made a lot of sense. Like when you take yourself out of it for a minute and you look at big picture, what they're trying to do, it makes a ton of sense on why they did it. And honestly, the process wasn't even that bad. So it was just new.
We see a microcosm of that even today here in Red Hat. I don't know if you've ever had one of the Windows laptops. Yes, you can get a Windows laptop as a Red Hat employee, but they have a utility where you can go in and you put in the thing and you fill out your credential and it gives you a temporary admin token so you can install something to your laptop if you need to.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and for access to production, there's a lot of compliance standards, and this is going to come, I think, in the next 2-3 years with signature-based signing and tokens and things like that, where anybody that touches production is going to have something signed for the time and the change. And this is a lot of FedRAMP is asking for this now, where there's only certain citizens and things like that that can touch a production application because of the sensitive data. And so, it's not just that you have access, it's that you're given access at a specific time with a specific token to do a specific thing. And that's where the security space seems to be moving in the next couple of years, just based on the regulations that I'm seeing come out of the White House.
And that's kind of what we saw from Hillary too, right? Andrew, with the SRE team, like if they ever want to make a change, like it's not just, oh, let me go fix this thing really quick. It's like, okay, let me document this thing that I need to do, and then I can finally go do it, and then document the change after it.
Yeah,
so it's a full-on process.
Yeah, and depending on, I won't say the severity, but the level of access that they need and the break glass protocols and stuff like that they have to go through, very, very much in line with that.
For sure. Any, they see the chat throwing some opinions out there. Any security incidences that the chat has run into? Otherwise, I mean, I can go into a bunch of different use cases. Apache struts, Heartbleed. We can talk about the Docker Hub breach, the need for everyone to have a very specific token generated every time to make you want the change. Yeah, it really just depends. That that could be one use case, and that would probably only be for production, right? Like typically you want your developers to have access to the pipeline to be able to see and make changes. Again, we're talking about probably some of the more secure applications and things that are federally regulated to have that sort of fine-grained access. Those certs are definitely getting rotated. Like even if it's tokens or certs that you're given, they're getting rotated regularly. So even if somebody does have access, they're going to have to authenticate when they make a change again. But no, there is no one size fits all. And that's what makes the security conversation so difficult. And it's why there's 1,000 security tools out there. I always laugh when you go through the RFP process with different customers, and it's not about that there isn't enough coverage in the security landscape. It's, I know we're going to need 6 to 9 tools. What tools fit the use case best, and where's the overlap? Seems to be the general conversation that I have with a lot of customers, right? You have maybe your cloud workload protection platform. Maybe you have a Kubernetes security platform as well. And then you're going to have your identity management solution. You're going to have a firewall and endpoint detection response solution, but nobody really covers that wide breadth of scenarios. So that it's really hard to know, hey, I need a runtime solution for Kubernetes. Does this cloud workload protection platform cover it all? So there isn't that much coverage. It's just picking the right tool for the job. And I was going to say we can get into malware in a bit because I can dive into the right tool for the job on that one if we want.
Yes, malware/ransomware.
Yeah. What ACS tool? Sorry, go ahead, Jonny.
No, I was just going to go back and ask some of the questions that we got. One was from Sabian. If you allow containers to have bash running, could you tell ACS to ignore a certain shell or a certain shell command that are being attempted or that are being executed?
Yeah. So ACS by default will flag a bash shell because it's just not the typical behavior that we want to see in containers. So it will come up in red on the runtime detection. And then you can say, yes, we are okay with this. You can flag certain commands by certain containers by a specific namespace. So you can say in this namespace, this container is allowed to run only these commands. And then if a container in that namespace executes a different command, you can either enforce on that, evict the container, or you'll just get notified depending on how you set up your notification channels. Again, that enforcement. So ACS by default, if you're installing sensor, this secured cluster, the sensor, it doesn't enforce policy unless you choose to enforce it. And that's by design because we don't want the security team or a team going in and then just saying, hey, we don't want bash to be running in any container, applying it to all the clusters at once because they might not understand the scope, and then kicking out all the developers' containers that are doing maybe some testing or something like that and using bash to do it. So we always recommend you implement ACS, you look at the container, look at the commands that it's executing, say, is this the typical behavior? Yes. Okay. That's allow listed. And then we're going to set up a policy. So anything new that pops up, we get notified. And then maybe a month comes by, a release goes through, and there's a new command. Security is just like, is this what's going on with this command? Is this new? Sends it to the development team. They're like, oh yeah, we implemented this new functionality in the most recent release. Like, okay, that's going to be allow listed now, right? So that hopefully that answers your question in a long-winded way, but I know there's another one coming up too.
Yep, and then the next one's from Dwayne. What ACS tools apply runtime security at the edge or IoT? How do you see AI addressing security at the edge? And then he's talking about message brokering specifically.
So this is my take on edge. Edge really shouldn't be any sort of storage. It's more data collection and ingestion, your point of service, whatever it is. So they're made to be brought up and collapsed in general. So ACS can be lightweight as a sensor where you use Ansible or ACM. A cluster gets brought up on the edge. It has secured cluster already installed, and it can give you real-time feedback on that. We could stop specific. We can implement network segmentation that way, but it has all the typical ACS features if you were to deploy it on an OpenShift cluster at the edge, and nothing changes. I think if you were on a RHEL node without OpenShift and you were looking to install ACS, and we're looking at expanding into that, we have an ACS roadmap coming up in a month if you want a little bit more detail. But let's say you're Red Hat Edge, you deploy a RHEL container, RHEL virtual machine and it has, Podman running on it, we want to have an ACS agent, basically an eBPF agent, to be able to secure those containers in the future and funnel all that information to central. So that's roadmap. Don't ping me if the PMs get mad that I said that. It's public. So, but yeah.
So does Microsoft fall into that same like Red Hat Edge kind of conversation?
Yeah.
So if you have Microsoft, you can spin up you can create the manifest for secure.
Yeah, secured cluster. You are going to need that data collection, right? And so that's the thing with Edge is if for example you have a stateless virtual machine that really is just about data ingestion and sending it back, well then it's more important that you're looking at the logs and digesting, is this normal behavior? If this isn't normal behavior, then kill the host and bring it back up, right? And do that efficiently, because you also don't want to burden all your edge devices with a massive security tool that is looking for malware when it's not attached to storage and we don't really care if anybody has it. We really more care is somebody exploiting it and trying to gain access into our internal network. And so we want to make sure that network segmentation is set up properly. I think from the AI perspective, one of the difficult things in security is implementing AI in a recommendation mode, because there are so many legal aspects to recommending a security policy from a legal aspect, right? The quickest way you can implement AI in security is data ingestion, logs, behavior analytics, to say like, hey, we have years of data of this application and how it's running. Just watch all the logs coming in and see if anything changes. And then, any one thing that pops out, AI is going to be better at catching that than a human sitting there reading logs.
Yeah, I'm going to nitpick and say that's not AI. It's machine learning doing pattern recognition.
Yeah.
I feel like that is a good use case, right? And it's something that I think could potentially, you said something a moment ago that was really interesting to me, which is treating those edge devices, which are effectively just collect and forward type of devices, or application workloads most of the time, but treating them as disposable, right? Not literally the piece of hardware is being disposable, but whatever that workload is, whether it's a virtual machine, a container, whatever it happens to be, is disposable. So we don't necessarily need to have a heavyweight, thing watching that, on a heavyweight runtime application security payload running on there. We can watch it from the other end, and if it becomes an anomaly, man, I cannot word today.
Terrible word.
And that's a hard one. So.
We just reset it, right? We turn it, reset it back to its default state and let it restart and let things, basically I wouldn't say we don't worry about it, because we obviously want to figure out how it was compromised and that type of stuff. But we don't have to do that on device sensing. Now maybe you could use, a machine learning model or something like that to help detect it even earlier, or, those types of things. There's lots of other ways that you can do that.
Yeah, there is. I'm trying to find it. Not sandbox containers. I forget what they're called, but in the new Kubernetes version, container snapshots. And basically in Kubernetes, you can, in the newest version, I think it's an alpha, you can take a container snapshot of whatever's running and then kill the existing pod. So kind of like a VM snapshot of, we're just applying the same things to containers now. But the whole purpose of a container is the life cycle is short. It does what it needs and then it goes away, right? So that is difficult from a security perspective to be able to see all that, pull it all when you're constantly just bringing containers up and then killing them, right? So it's more about just getting that general pattern of what a container is supposed to do. And then if a container gets brought up in a weird way, or maybe there's a crypto mining container that shouldn't be on the host, that we're recognizing those things and reporting it. But as for the sandbox container, that's the general conversation of malware and things like that. Do you take a snapshot and kill the host? How do you do auditing on it? How do you make sure this doesn't happen again? There's a bunch of different ways to do it.
Yeah.
Again, at the edge, it's more about efficiency. So it's a difficult conversation with security. And edge devices, everybody has a different interpretation. Like, is it a point of sale? Is it a remote oil and gas plant where they actually have like pretty sizable servers on site? Like, that's an edge device too. So it really just depends on the size and the resources you have.
Yeah. I'll say, my, interpretation, perspective on, AI and security is, it's AI specifically, I think, is risky in that respect because at least today, if you look at something like ChatGPT, it's known to be frequently wrong. And so you still need a human who is there, who is able to look at and make a decision of, is this something that is legitimate? Is this something that, is this valid, data? Is this valid information that I'm getting? Can it be used to, and we see this happening, with Ansible Lightspeed and the other things, can it be used to accelerate time to response and stuff like that? Instead of spending 30 minutes with me having to go and look up, what's this, Ansible module, how do I use this Ansible module? What are the things that I need? Instead, it's just, do this thing and it figures out 95% of it, but I still have to do the last little bit. I think that could be beneficial in those areas, but machine learning, pattern recognition, that type of stuff I see as being hugely beneficial, but it's something that we've been doing for a long time anyways. And by we, I mean industry-wide, not Red Hat specifically.
The royal we.
Yeah. Let's see, Thorium asks, how do I create a K-bomb from my clusters?
K-bomb. Yeah, that's an interesting one. That KSOC, the company KSOC came up with a K-bomb based off of the S-bomb move, and they have a pretty good tool for that.
So let me pause you and ask, what is K-bomb first?
Kubernetes bill of materials. So it's if you've heard of S-bomb and software bill of materials, basically it is typically an JSON format output of all the configuration details of what you're running, including the different containers for Kubernetes or OpenShift and their tags. So you know exactly what software is running on your system. And the nice thing about that is you can basically just do a diff against the two. So you update Kubernetes, you can see exactly what changes in the state of your cluster. You can also go back and verify that the SHA signatures are correct based off what you're deploying. So they're basically taking the software bill of materials and composition analysis tracking and mapping it to Kubernetes. Now, how effective is something like that? It really just depends. I mean, if you have a pretty good software ingestion pipeline, you're doing that at the front end anyways. So let's say you're upgrading your Kubernetes or OpenShift, you're probably testing the newest release, whether it's OpenShift 4.1.4 or 4.1.3 or something like that. You're going through and making sure that the cluster is secure beforehand. So how much that diff is there, I'm not sure it matters, but I think it's really useful for smaller to medium companies, especially with small DevOps teams who don't have the tools to be able to, or the, let's say, resources to be able to verify everything. Hopefully that answered your question. And no, I wasn't referring to volume snapshots. The name will come to me. It was in one of the newer releases, and basically it takes a snapshot of the volume and the running container, and then triages it so that you can do auditing on what happened after. And this is a highly requested feature just because security teams are so used to looking at VMs. It's like, oh, we have a honeypot, somebody's running malware in our honeypot, like take a snapshot, keep it up. And then we look at the snapshot while somebody else is doing whatever they want to do in the existing running honeypot. So that's sort of what they're trying to accomplish. Again, that's not, the container lifecycle is much different from VMs. And so getting security teams to understand that and give them the tools that kind of match up with what they're trying to do is always tricky.
Well, it's similar to, like, you said it, or you alluded to it earlier, right? Like, they do it now with VMs, right? They'll send up a VM that's basically like they can let somebody go in and just get after it, and then they can take that snapshot and they can go back in, or they can open like a debug console into it and just do their thing, right? Like those tools have been there for a long time on the virtual machine side, but now it's, we're just enabling people on the container side to do it, which is pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I think it's because people always take malware in VMs and they kind of map it to containers, and they say, okay, we want to see if a file system changes, or we want to, there's a bunch of different ways you can do malware scanning, and it doesn't really map the same when it comes to containers, right? Like you could do signature-based detection, behavioral-based detection, but again, then you need a security tool that's on the host, not even in OpenShift or Kubernetes doing that scanning. So you really are installing a pretty heavyweight detection system. The other issue is if you have behavioral based, for example, you're gonna get a lot of false positives because developers are going in there and they're changing things and they're doing stuff that security teams don't know. If you use something like a signature based, well, then you have to know what the malware is in order to detect it. So you're not really safe from the 0 day, for example, if somebody creates a new malware type. So there's always these trade-offs with the malware, the runtime scanning, where people come and they say, hey, does your tool do malware scanning? It's like, yes, but which type? Is it behavior based? Because that's going to have its trade-offs. So there's another question when it comes to runtime that people need to dig into. And in general, again, having that anomalous behavior and I got it that time really, really helps for the security teams to be able to see like what's different. And you don't necessarily need to act right away, especially if it's not something that's attached to a database or credentials or things like that, which is where that zero trust policy comes in. It's like, oh, it's in a namespace on an edge device. It's stateless. There's some weird behavior going in there. Let's do some research into it versus, oh, this is our major database and there's some weird activity going on. We need to respond right away. So that context is obviously extremely useful, and not all security teams and security tools can give that Kubernetes and OpenShift context either, right? I don't want to say a lot of security tools, but some, they're focused on container scanning, network detection, but they don't really touch on the Kubernetes configuration aspects. So to them, every vulnerability looks like a huge deal. It's like, okay, well, when you put it in the context of where the application's running, it's network access, really, there's nobody can really exploit it. And you can go through that checklist.
So to poke at that bear again, is that an area where AI could potentially help? Again, I always look at AI and the tools that we have available right now as being helpful for adding or being aware of context with things. And I wonder if that's an area where there could be potential improvements in the future.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so. Right now, like you can do a lot of scanning over the YAML files, and you can use Roxcuttle to implement policies, and it'll spit out all the changes you need to make into a YAML file or something like that. It would be interesting to see I take the runtime detection information and the YAML and maybe the language or the software composition analysis, maybe it's an SBOM or whatever, correlate all three and then show, hey, there have been some recent attacks with this. This is extremely vulnerable and something that you want to fix. I think that sort of correlation and learning is pretty useful. But again, you still run into the same issue as security, false positives. There is the legal aspect of I tell you to change something and I'm wrong. Who do you go after, right? So that model needs to be extremely, extremely, we'll say potent, right? Because you see if ChatGPT spits out the wrong answer, it's on my Twitter X thread about somebody complaining, hey, you gave me the wrong recommendation for things. So there's the ethical side of it too, right?
I never even considered the legal aspects of it, to be honest with you. Like when you brought that up, I was like, oh yeah, dang, that makes a lot of sense. Like that would suck.
Yeah, like there's a couple of IAC scanning tools that have implemented AI where it's like, oh, generate me some Ansible code, and then you put it into ChatGPT, say, okay, can you secure this? And then it goes through and says, hey, I've noticed that these are some of the issues, but there's always an asterisk saying these are recommendations for changes. It was always implied when you had a security tool and you implemented a policy that we can give you 100 policies with the best practice of what to do, but you still need to understand how to apply them to your containers because we don't want to break your workloads, right? Now with AI, the responsibility, it feels like it's shifted, or we're not exactly sure who's responsible for the suggestion and the implementation. A lot of customers want automatic GitHub or GitLab commits to say, fix this, or here's a recommendation to say, hey, this is insecure. You automate that, and then somebody has an AI recommendation, an automatic exception in their GitHub or GitLab pipeline or something like that, and then AI is making a change in production. Like there has to be very specific gates as to who's responsible for what, which it's going to be an interesting couple of years coming up. Let's say that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's deep. Yeah, that's because it sounds awesome, right? Like the practice, the idea of that automation sounds amazing. And then it's like that one time that it's wrong and it's a big one. You know what I mean? Like it's like the time that it turns SC Linux off on Equifax, and then next thing you know, everybody's credit history is jacked.
Yep.
Oops.
Yeah, that was one of my examples. There's a good example. Yeah, but not a risk. Removing known vulnerabilities from containers is good from a single noise standpoint. Yes. The issue is like if you go and install, if you have a pretty big cluster, you're going to see thousands of vulnerabilities, 2,000 vulnerabilities. But the low medium ones we don't necessarily really care about unless there's a known exploit. The high critical ones we want to focus on. Also worth noting that when you patch a vulnerability, it doesn't mean that another vulnerability won't come up in the application itself, right? So you're telling developers, hey, we need to update to a new fix, or maybe we need to, update our curl. package or something like that, but then they might not be following the new features that are implemented in curl. They bring a default configuration from the application, and they introduce another vulnerability aspect into theirs. So when we are spending engineering time fixing high or critical and important vulnerabilities, high critical important vulnerabilities, we also want to recognize that any change in code also, can lead to something else, which is why we focus on those important ones where we know the benefit outweighs the risk of introducing something new, right? The example of this is the Log4Shell. Like, they came out with a patch. The patch right after didn't actually fix one of the initial issues, and then we had to implement another patch. And so everyone was kind of chasing the dragon for, is this the one? Is this the one? Is it right? Like, is this the one? So we want to make sure that we're not just, well, we are cutting down on noise. The security team needs to cut down on the noise for the developer. That really is one of their jobs. Now security teams have the right complaint to say, can we, as let's say a global entity, cut down on false positives, making sure that we are actually poking our developers when they need to, so that they're seeing the vulnerabilities, that we're seeing the vulnerabilities, and we can communicate that in a cohesive manner. That's a pretty reasonable complaint. But yeah, in general, being in security is kind of a thankless job. When everything goes smoothly, nobody's complaining. When things go poorly, it's security's fault. And really, security's job is to pave the way for the developers to make sure that the guardrails are in place, that the vulnerabilities are triaged, and that they're cracking the whip to get things changed, right? So it's a tough ask. You need a tool to help you. So
there's a great quote from Futurama that always comes to mind, where I think it's from Bender, or an episode with Bender, where if you do it right, nobody knows you've done anything at all.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the comments here in chat are reminiscent of that, right? Here, our Hope 9, right? Security will always be the opposite of convenience, which I think you could almost apply that sentiment to anything.
Mm-hmm.
You think if going to work, having a job is the opposite of the convenience of staying at home and doing nothing or something like that. I think the benefit there is having a job means that, well, I can afford to live and do all the things that we do as humans and all that other stuff, whereas accepting that inconvenience associated with security means that we are avoiding causing security incidents, right? All those other things, just like you do with any other role, any other thing that's inconvenient. When I used to install servers, was it convenient to organize the cables in the back of the rack? No, it was awful and it was hot. but it did help things, right? We avoided a lot of heat issues by doing that, and early server deaths.
Mm-hmm. There's the other aspect of convenient for who? For the developer, yes. For the business, probably not, right? Like, we have to follow regulations and compliance standards that help us get into markets because we are secure in this way, right? And it helps us avoid legal aspects. It helps us avoid the downtime of having, memory glut that shuts down servers for a couple of days, right? Like, those are, it's a minor inconvenience that has a larger upside. And it's like giving a cookie to a 3-year-old and you say, I'll give you 3 cookies if you just wait a little bit. And once you figure out that the trade-off is there, and it's like, okay, there's a guardrail there for a reason, maybe I shouldn't just kick the fence over, then it starts to make a little bit more sense. And there's always going to be a back and forth between what should be a fence and what shouldn't be between teams. And the more information you have to communicate, to say, hey, you have these vulnerabilities, these network policies that are needed, and you can share the context, the more you can agree over why the fence is there. When security is just yelling about, hey, don't kick the fence, and developers have no clue what security is talking about, that's when frustrations flare.
Yeah, it's good. It's good perspective too, right? Because it's like, yes, it's an inconvenience for you, but this isn't your stuff, right? It's not like you're running this app on your laptop at home, or your like little Raspberry Pi at home, and you're not doing this, right? This is a business or an enterprise or something like that you're making this change on, that you don't own. You just happen to be a steward of, and so yes, while it may be inconvenient to you, it is for the greater good of the company.
Hey, the security controls are off on my Pi behind me, but I would never implement that
right
anywhere near an organization. Yeah, it's very convenient for me. I appreciate my lackadaisical approach. Yeah,
that's right.
Well, But to your point, Johnny, and Dwayne touched on that, right? Of it needs to be, cybersecurity, security aspects is a workforce skill.
Mhm.
I having been in this industry, and I say IT broadly, not security specifically, we've been trying to do that. I mean, 20 something years ago when I was in the military, I used to give cybersecurity briefings, and by briefings, I mean like training to,
Yes.
the people, this was in the early 2000s, but here's what a phishing attack is. Here's how to identify that. Well, it's 2023 and we still have those, trainings every year. We have to go through the company mandated training on,
Yeah.
phishing and all of that other stuff. So, yes, there is definitely a education aspect to it. I think people have to genuinely invest in it and care and pay attention. How many times do you see something come through and somebody will raise the issue and it's, oh, just forward the email over to cybersecurity and, oh, I didn't know I could do that. Well, you've done I've been here for 5 years. I've done that training every year for 5 years. And like the number one thing is always send it to cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's never all of the above. It's send it to security, right? Like,
Yeah.
By the way, Jamie, I figured out what it was. It was forensic container checkpointing. And this is actually largely contributed by Red Hat and the cryo community, where you can stateful copies of a running container without the container knowing that it's been checkpointed. So instead of like ACS, if you have an enforcement policy, we'll just kill the container if there's behavior that you deem that you don't want. But with forensic container checkpointing, you can click it, say, hey, take a snapshot, leave the container up while you do your investigation. So yeah, that was bugging me the whole time, Jamie, but I'm like, how much attention can I give to searching? So I'm glad we found it. I think it's going to be really cool because it's going to start to get built into security tools, I think, in the coming releases, where you see a container, a policy gets triggered, and then automatically it tells Kubernetes to, hey, go take a snapshot of this, and then the security team can go through and look at it without having to dig through a ton of logs, right? Because if the container just gets brought up, killed in 30 seconds, now I'm going through like, where'd that container go? Oh, there it is. It's like, I'm just going to have a list of container snapshots when I check into my security tool to say, hey, these are like the 5 anomalous things that happened overnight. We didn't kill the containers because it didn't really seem to be interfering with anything, but you might want to take a look. So I think it's pretty cool. And I'll be back in 6 months. We can talk about it.
Yes.
See, our Hope 9 makes a comment here about software vendors not raising major versions in order to avoid recertifications. I don't know why. That's something that always irked me, because I get it, in that recertification, especially if you're working in a highly regulated industry or something like that, it's a pain, but it's there for a reason.
Mhm.
And you're sort of playing with fire at that point of, architecturally, whatever components, etc. There have been significant fundamental changes that deserve to go through all of these audits and all of these things, but I'm not going to do that. And so what would happen if there is a compromise? What would happen if, it is because you avoided that and it should have been found, it should have been corrected,
Yeah,
Wh-
you have a breaking change, but you don't update the major version because you don't want to recertify. So then people poorly implement the breaking change, leading to more hacks and more issues that have popped up. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question for, is the security gate too strong? Is it delaying innovation, right? That's a pretty general feeling. But when you're in an industry like that, there is a one-size approach to the regulation, which is the downside of that, right? And I think you look at some of the white papers that have come out of the White House over the last 2 years with SALSA and supply chain security, which we'll get into next week. They're kind of pushing the envelope, but allowing the big tech companies to figure out what makes sense. And then I think that when things shake out in the next 3 years, then you're going to start to see some pretty heavy-handed regulation come down to say, no, we need everything signature-based. No, we need an SBOM with every piece of software that's shipped. And every single major software vendor has their own internal software supply chain. So we're going to see who has the better ones, who has to make more changes, let's say.
I mean, I think, the reason why we have to have regulation for this is because companies won't choose to do the quote unquote right thing when it comes to this, right? And, your point about, is the regulation too heavy handed? Is it too much of a gateway or a gatekeeper to be useful? I feel like when a company is willingly and knowingly putting that off, it's a red flag, and it's one of those things that
Yeah.
I don't know. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, no, it's deceitful, right? Like it's wrong.
Yeah,
That's just wrong.
I think one of the better things, especially with these security pushes from the government, is when you start to see security as a business opener where I can get into markets when my application is compliant, regulated, and secure, you're going to make those changes. It's just the incentive is there. So when the security incentive to not do the thing isn't there, you're going to get pushback in people doing the other thing, right? So if the incentive is, hey, the recertification is a costly, time-intensive process, then I'm not going to do it. But if, for example, we said, hey, these certain things that are changed in your application are considered breaking changes, if you don't update to the next major version, it's going to be considered a recertification anyways. Then you're going to start to see everybody start to go through that process. And yes, it's painful, but if everybody has to go through it, then the incentive to not isn't there, for example. Now, how you regulate that, I have no clue. And I think that that's one of the issues is like, where's the stick when somebody does something poorly? But yeah, it's always incentive based for security, and saying once you start having the conversation of security as an enabler for business, then it becomes a lot easier and to push back when somebody says, hey, it's not extremely useful.
Yeah. I mean, you could look at Red Hat as being an example of success there, right? Having RHEL certified for all of these different things is a business enabler for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Things like FedRAMP for cloud service, like those open massive markets, right? Once something is GA and FedRAMP, now all of a sudden you go on the top list of vendors for specific things, right? And that's by design, because we've also validated that your software supply chain's there. There's certain trusted citizens operating in production, right? Like there's a ton of cost towards making these applications secure. Let's say that the average user doesn't see when they look at their software bill and they're like, wait, this costs this much? It's like, yeah, there's a lot of compliance and regulation for software these days, and it does take up a lot of resources.
If you don't want to get the email that says that your stuff has been leaked, then yes, it costs that much, right?
Yeah.
So we're coming up on a quarter after the hour, which is usually when we try and wrap things up. So for the audience, thank you for all of the interactivity, all of the chat. We love to hear from you all. We love to get interactivity with you all. So if you have any questions, comments, anything that you want to raise, go ahead and post that into chat, and we'll do our best to address that here before we end the stream. If you're not listening to us live, I know a couple of folks have asked about, somebody sent me a message the other day asking if there was a way that they could download just the audio of these, so that way you could listen to it like a podcast, which today's stream would be a great example of that. There's some third party and other open source things that are out there. I don't have any of the links handy, but you can, kind of search on your favorite search engine for ways to download YouTube videos, and that'll pop up. But yeah, otherwise, this has been very informative, Mike. I appreciate it. Runtime security is one of those things that I think, at least me, and I am at best security tangential in many ways. It's not something that I deliberately think about, right? You just assume that it's there. You just assume that there's going to be something that is, watching, monitoring, keeping an eye on things, and it's not always true, right? And having tools, having that utility belt, I'm envisioning Batman in my head, at your disposal is supremely valuable. So thank you. This has been super helpful.
No problem. I encourage people to try out ACS Cloud Service. Extremely easy. If you want to go and test all of my theories and features that I've talked about, sign up free, 60 days. And we have obviously the security 4.4, more supply chain focused, which we kind of dipped into, but I'm interested to see Jafar's take on it next week. So I'll be joining next Wednesday.
Yeah, just all I ask is throw tomatoes, not rocks.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be fun. I'm looking forward to that. Software supply chain security, or supply chain security. Apparently now we're just dropping the software from that. It's a topic that is interesting to me as we see more and more of those supply chain exploits happen. What was the big one with the gosh, why am I now forgetting that software? The one that affected the federal government.
SolarWinds.
SolarWinds. Thank you. You know, that was sort of the biggest one that I think many people really became aware of. But it's not a new thing by any stretch of the imagination. You know, how long have NPM modules had crypto miners hidden in them? You know, or even for that matter, Chrome browser extensions and stuff like that.
Yeah. Linux Mint like 5 years ago, right? Or something like that, 7 years ago. Like they're distributing their ISO. When they were making them, they had some malware that was getting distributed as part of their ISO. So people were downloading it, not knowing that they had like this malware in it. And then like just recently, Ubuntu had like a similar distribution issue. So I mean, it's everywhere. SolarWinds just put it in everybody's house, right? I mean, it made it a household thing. So
yeah. All right. Well, I got nothing else. Like I said, I've been kind of quiet this time because I've just been learning. This is an area that I admit that I don't have a depth of knowledge in. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So for anybody, any other comments or anything like that, our Hope 9, yeah, you pointed out the one that I'm most aware of there. For anybody who has any comments, please go ahead and submit those over. Otherwise, Mike, if there's any last comments that you have.
No, just check out the project. We'd love to see you in the Slack channel. And even if you're testing it out and have any feedback, it's always welcome from the open source community. We appreciate any issues that are opened, even if it's in the chat and it's like, hey, I don't really like this feature. It looks kind of weird. That's always great. So again, test out that cloud trial and stackrocks.io for any information. There's a Slack channel invite that you can click on to interact directly with our engineers if you have any more questions.
And with all that, Jonny, last words.
I got nothing, man. This was a good one. I really enjoyed your time, Mike. I really appreciate all the insight and stuff like that. So thanks for coming on. And hopefully it's sooner than 6 months. You know, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. And we'll see you at the What's Next on Thursday next week.